Kwame Nkrumah, The Spark of African Independence by Peter Butler and Robert O'Brien. Freedom is not something that one people can bestow on another as a gift. They claim it as their own, and none can keep it from them. Kwame Nkrumah. The African continent has been a highly sensitive issue pertaining to its historical context, as well as its current political status. For centuries, the land, its resources, its people, and the seaports of Africa have been exploited by invaders with impunity, and as of today, the colonies of the African continent have only been recently liberated, and the unsavory memory of imperialism and colonialism still lingers. In the midst of the momentous movement for an Africa which would one day be free from the imperialist stranglehold as well as be a home for sovereign states, Kwame Nkrumah was immensely influential in the discussion over the plight of the African continent, including the African diaspora. Nkrumah had left a legacy that has set a precedent for a pragmatic approach to the potential unity of all of Africa, whilst meeting in the historic Pan-African Congress. In order for one to fully comprehend the significance of F.K. Nkrumah's contribution to the 5th Pan-African Congress, historical context is essential. The 5th PAC took place in Manchester, England in 1945, and the conference was implemented to resolve discrepancies from the previous PACs, as well as to be the catalyst for future pragmatism referring to the African continent, as well as the galvanization of the black diaspora. Key speakers of the conference were the American black nationalist W.B. Du Bois, speakers on behalf of the Black Caribbean movement, and prominent representatives coming from the African continent, such as Kwame Nkrumah. These individuals were pragmatists. They were compelled to make this Pan-Africanist Congress monumental in the course of the African focus. However, during the meeting in Manchester, it was not known how much of the legacy Kwame Nkrumah would go on to make on the future of the Pan-Africanist movement, as well as in the potential for an African unity as a whole. It was not long before the focus of the 5th PAC began to move in a collective manner towards the political aspirations which would begin to affect the Pan-Africanist movement. Kwame Nkrumah was the first person since Marcus Garvey to revisit the concept of black empowerment, as well as a seminal African unity prospect. Before this time, there were a few dissenting schools of thought in regards to the African unity movement. The most widely supported Pan-Africanist view before this time was the African empowerment movement. This perspective was initiated by the Garveyite school of thought and sought to empower all Africans and people of African descent. The contemporary perspective during this time was the fight amongst the African people for political equality on the global stage. This viewpoint was championed by thinkers that viewed the Garveyite movement as a little extreme, and they sought to assume political equality and recognition within the existing society that they currently lived in, as opposed to a back to Africa movement. In fact, later in Nkrumah's career as the Ghanaian president, he faced a major conflict over fast industrialization at the expense of democratic ideals. This tumultuous period for Nkrumah would begin to test his stance on the perceived rights of African citizens, and he even endured political criticism. However, the staunch Pan-African promoter, Nkrumah did not waver in his devotion to a united Africa, and his impact can be seen in the growing construct of educators, activists, and pragmatists who would go on to be in support of the movement. This was pivotal in the Pan-Africanist movement because prior to this, the fate of the movement could have potentially moved into several different directions. This would ultimately have an effect on the current global position the African continent faces. One of the major reasons that the 5th Pan-African Congress was as instrumental as it was primarily due to the workings of Kwame Nkrumah. The future leader of a free Ghana can be identified in every aspect of the 5th PAC. Dr. Nkrumah contributed by organizing the Congress, being a prime voice in the actual PAC, and making sure that what was drawn out in this Congress was implemented after the meeting had been adjourned. In its earliest stages, Nkrumah was determined to address problems that the previous Congresses had failed to touch upon before it. It was his goal to bring the problems that the continent of Africa was facing into center stage through this Congress, with the main focus being the aggressive liberation of the African continent from the control of the imperialist powers. Nkrumah, along with the help of the Trinidadian Pan-Africanist scholar George Padmore, brought the Fifth Pan-African Congress to Manchester, England. Thus, by being instrumental in the construction of the Fifth PAC, he ensured that his voice and opinion would be an inspiring one throughout the Congress. Once the Congress took place from October 15th to 18th, 1945 in Manchester, England, Nkrumah's influence over the conference can visibly be seen. During Nkrumah's early years, he was educated in Gold Coast schools, but subsequently went to the U.S., where he obtained a doctorate from Lincoln University in Pennsylvania. His education and the people he met throughout his early years would be pivotal later in life, especially in his Fifth PAC. For one, through Nkrumah's contributions, the Congress departed from an earlier Pan-African Congress, which was dominated by professionals and members by the intellectual class, and it was widely held that Nkrumah's own involvement with the West African Studies Union and associations of Africanist students states that America contributed largely to this departure. The strong participation of the youth and students in this Congress was also a clear manifestation of Nkrumah's organizational ability. In addition, as stated earlier, the topic of this Congress was perpetuated by the liberation of the continent of Africa from imperialist states and Nkrumah's view of the unification of the African continent to promote the collective well-being of the continent. The success of the Fifth Pan-African Congress and the ideas that Nkrumah brought to the conference can easily be seen in decades following the Manchester meeting. Nkrumah sought to be led by example, and upon completion of the Fifth Pan-African Congress, the majority of the states making up the continent of Africa gained much anticipated liberation from imperialist states. The first nation to gain independence, with no surprise, was none other than Kwame Nkrumah's home country, Ghana. Nkrumah was determined to put the ideas he brought to the Fifth Pan-African Congress into aggressive action. This was different than the previous Pan-African Congresses, which took a less urgent approach to the topics that were discussed prior. Nkrumah was ecstatic that his home country of Ghana had finally gained independence. However, he would not be satisfied until the whole continent of Africa would gain its independence. The liberation of Ghana through Nkrumah's diligence is characterized as a springboard to the liberation of the rest of the states within the African continent. In fact, within 10 years of the liberation of Ghana, 90% of Africa's continent gained its independence. Around the time the continent was gaining independence from the previous colonialist regimes, the youth of the African continent that Nkrumah brought to the Fifth Pan-African Congress eventually began mobilizing and acting as a catalyst towards the liberation movements in their own states. In every form one may look at the liberation of the African continent, Kwame Nkrumah was indeed a pivotal player, and his legacy is recognized on the continent as well as in the galvanization of the African diaspora.